Thank you, Bill. Please welcome back Professor Millikan.
Thank you very much. Now, unlike Bill, I'm not an experienced pro at these things. This is my first, so I'm going to have to be a bit careful with the time. Bill's made some very interesting responses there, but I'm going to come back to those once I know how much time I've got. Because before that, I want to say something about the fine-tuning argument, and that will be pertinent to some of the comments that Bill has already made. So the fine-tuning argument is based on some apparent coincidences in physics that are genuinely intriguing, and I would concede this much to it, that if there is a physically inexplicable coincidence of the fundamental constants of nature, whose values have to be precisely tuned within a wide range of otherwise available possibilities to make a complex universe possible, then this constitutes a phenomenon which very naturally invites explanation in terms of a cosmic scale designer. But I also see good reason for caution and modesty here. First, we must beware our natural tendency to see purpose in things too readily. This can make us bad judges of what is an impressive coincidence and what is not. Secondly, we only have experience of this universe. So even making sense of cosmic probabilistic claims is problematic. Our experiments and observations have a sample size of 1, and we really have no idea of the range of possible alternative scenarios. Suppose someone in the 16th century or before were trying to imagine modern physics. Thirdly, we can't rule out that some deeper explanation will be found for any apparent coincidences. For example, Guth's theory of cosmic inflation can explain some of them. Thirdly, there might be multiple universes, such as a world ensemble, an evolving sequence, or a complex of bubble universes, each with its own Big Bang and different conditions. Then it would be no surprise at all that observers have evolved only in those universes that are conducive to life. Fourthly, the physics on which this entire argument is based is young, incomplete, and radically imperfect. It's less than 100 years since general relativity and quantum mechanics, our best theories of the large and the small, were developed, and we still have no way of reconciling these with each other. String theory attempts this and speculates that the universe has 11 dimensions in order to facilitate it. But that still has a very long way to go and is widely regarded with amused skepticism by experimental physicists. Even worse, barely 30 years have passed since the existence of dark matter was corroborated, and only 13 years since dark energy was postulated. We still don't have much clue what either of these are, but analysis of the latest data from space suggests that 72.8% of the mass of the universe is constituted by dark energy and 22.7% by dark matter. That leaves only 4.56% as atomic matter, the stuff that we knew to exist prior to 1980. In short, a huge proportion of modern physics, including the results that Bill appeals to, is extremely recent and riddled with unsolved problems and anomalies. How likely is it that the physics of 100 years hence will look the same? Quite apart from all this, the fine-tuning argument seems very ill-adapted for proving or even supporting the existence of an omniperfect Christian God. One important point is that it does nothing to favour the existence of a morally perfect God over an equally powerful but supremely evil God, a nasty character I have called anti-God. Any reason that God would have for facilitating the evolution of complex, conscious, morally sensitive creatures capable of a loving relationship would equally be a reason for anti-God. The same qualities which give the potential for joy and love equally give the potential for misery and hate. So the fine-tuning argument does nothing to support the claim that God is good rather than evil, or indeed morally neutral. Perhaps the universe was just an amusing experiment or an exercise in dynamic art. But an even more serious problem focuses on God's alleged omnipotence and omniscience. For on this hypothesis, the Christian hypothesis, God does not have to work within anything like the existing physical rules in order to create the universe. He can make up and impose whatever rules he likes, and know infallibly, without even having to experiment, exactly what their consequences will be. So if his main aim was to create a universe finely tuned for the development of intelligent life, one has to say that he's not been very efficient. Apparently it has taken nearly 14 billion years just to produce one species capable of relationship with him. To put that into perspective, if we think of the time since the Big Bang as a year, then the early Bronze Age was 11 seconds ago, and the life of Jesus of Nazareth barely 4.6 seconds. Moreover, according to the physics on which the fine-tune argument is based, even the entire period in which the stars and planets exist will be utterly dominated by the vastly longer period of black holes. Considering this as 1 year, the life of man on this planet would be an unimaginably tiny fraction of a picosecond. Again, the Milky Way galaxy has around 200 billion stars, and the latest observations suggest more than 125 billion other galaxies. Even if we make the generous assumption of one Earth-like habitable planet for every star, the overwhelming majority of the space in these galaxies, quite apart from the huge expanses between them, is totally inhospitable to life. To give an idea of the proportions here, the fine-tuning argument has been likened to claiming that a volume equal to 6 million Olympic swimming pools, but capable of holding only one molecule of water, is fine-tuned for water storage. There's yet another more specific problem for Christian theology here. If the universe is indeed fine-tuned to produce life capable of relationship with God, then presumably trillions of these vast numbers of alien planets will also contain such species. Yet when it was taken absolutely for granted that the Earth was the centre of the universe, the Nicene Creed told us that Jesus was the unique incarnation of the second person of the Holy Trinity and the pre-existing agent who created the world, by whom all things were made, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven, etc. Presumably now we must assume that the second person has enjoyed innumerable incarnations over space and time in a huge variety of shapes and sizes, and I look forward to seeing the theological working out of this implication of the fine-tuning argument. I now want to say a word about the issue of infinity, which is one of the things that Bill took up in his rebuttal there. He said that I hadn't addressed his philosophical arguments against infinity. Now, of course, I accept that reasoning with infinities is a bit strange. It's odd to think that you can have two infinite sets of objects, like the set of odd numbers and the set of even numbers, which when added together yield a set which is exactly the same size as each of them. But there's no contradiction here, and indeed we know, since the work of Georg Cantor, that it's entirely possible to treat operations with infinities rationally and rigorously. Now, suppose we take an infinite set, say all the integers counting upwards from 4, and we add 3 more elements, say the integers 1, 2, and 3. This yields another infinite set, the set of all positive integers. So infinity plus 3 equals infinity, and presumably infinity minus infinity equals 3, right? But as we know from the case of the odd numbers and the even numbers, infinity plus infinity equals infinity, which presumably means that infinity minus infinity equals infinity. So let's see those, they're up on the screen, together with a familiar arithmetical example to make clear what the pattern is. And the colours are intended to help there. There's nothing wrong with any of the additions here, but we can see that there's a problem, indeed an apparent contradiction, with the subtractions. Infinity minus infinity, apparently, cannot be given a consistent result. This is true, but absolutely nothing to worry about. Because all it means is that a certain equation, infinity plus what equals infinity, has more than one solution. When we say that 12 minus 7 equals 5, all we mean is that 5 is the unique solution to the equation 7 plus what equals 12. Where this sort of equation has more than one possible solution, we cannot properly talk about subtraction, because no unique value can be specified in that way. That's all. And there's absolutely nothing mysterious or contradictory about any of this. It's the same reason why you can't divide 0 by 0. The equation 0 times what equals 0 has lots of solutions. But that doesn't mean there's some fundamental problem with arithmetic using 0. It's just what you'd expect, given that 0 times anything yields the same result. Well, I have got a little bit of time now to address some of the things that Bill mentioned. He said that his method is logic and evidence. This is why I feel it's very important to go on and deal with the arguments. I'm not suggesting for a moment that my argument about the onus of proof by itself was anything like enough. I agree, incidentally, that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, but I disagree with his claim that if God existed, you'd expect a world just like this one, or at least it seemed to me that that was an implicit claim. If God existed, I would expect a world in which his existence was a great deal more plausible than the existence of anti-God. And I'm not going to argue that case in detail now. You've probably got enough of that in London from Stephen Law. Coincidentally, both he and I have written papers with that hypothesis, and quite independently. Vilenkin, the problem is that the contracting universe is unstable. Yes, but of course that depends on current physics. And I am saying that we have no reason whatever to be so terrifically confident about current physics. It's changing very quickly. The very fact that the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is so recent ought to make us aware of that. The quantum vacuum, it's not nothing. No, I agree it's not nothing, but then it's the nearest we get. It was a nice trick to quote David Hume against me. I never asserted so absurd a proposition that something can come into existence without a cause. No, indeed. And I don't think he did assert that. But Hume actually, this is one of the places where Hume nods. Hume is a determinist, but he hasn't got a good reason for his determinism. I published a paper last year actually arguing exactly that. He's wrong. On his own principles, he ought to be open to indeterminism. But he isn't. And I think he's just inheriting the prejudices of the time. The point I'm making is that we don't have any reason for this claim that nothing can come into existence without a cause, except from our experience. And the nearest we get in our experience to that, to things coming into existence without a cause, is in the quantum vacuum. All right, it may not be a perfect vacuum. It's the nearest we've got. So where is your evidence that nothing can come into existence without a cause? Abstract object or disembodied mind, I said, I don't see any basis for the assumption that those are the only options. There may be all sorts of things we've never thought of. I agree that mental properties aren't physical properties and that epiphenomenalism is incorrect, but I don't see that as a problem at all. A computer has algorithmic properties as well as physical properties. It doesn't mean there has to be some immaterial substance in the computer. Morals, I'm going to have to come back to.
Thank you, Professor Millikan, and welcome back now, Professor Craig, with his second rebuttal.
Well, you can see how these issues just open up into an incredible array of different questions. So let's take a deep breath and go at it one more round. Have we seen any good arguments for atheism tonight? Well, I think it was clear from that last speech that we haven't. I said that the absence of evidence for an object is evidence that it doesn't exist only in the case that it is highly probable that if the object did exist, we should expect to see more evidence of it than we do. And here Dr. Millikan simply asserted, honestly, his personal opinion. He says, I think if God existed, then his existence should be more obvious. But that's not much of an argument. I don't see any grounds for thinking that's highly probable. especially if we're dealing with a God who knows how people would react under different circumstances. He may well know that giving any more evidence of his existence would not lead more people to love and come to know his salvation and find eternal life. God isn't interested in just convincing people that there's one more piece of furniture in the universe, some extra object to add to their ontology. He wants people to come into a saving relationship with him. And it may well be the case that God knew that if he were to provide any more evidence, it wouldn't do any more good in bringing people into such a relationship. If people won't look at the evidence that we have now, perhaps they wouldn't have come to know God and find salvation, even if the existence of God were as plain as the nose on your face. Indeed, they might have come to resent a God who made his existence so obvious for such effrontery. So we don't have really any good argument to think that God does not exist tonight. So do we have good reasons to think that theism is true? Let's talk first about the origin of the universe. First, we saw philosophical and scientific evidence that the universe began to exist. With regard to the philosophical argument, Dr. Millikan says that infinity minus infinity is not defined in transfinite arithmetic. There's more than one solution to the equation. And that is precisely the problem when you try to translate this into the real world. You can slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to subtract infinity from infinity, but you can't stop someone from taking away a certain number of coins. And the contradiction is that you have identical quantities, you subtract identical quantities, and you come up with non-identical results. And it needs to be understood, infinity in this case is not that sideways lazy 8. It's the number aleph null, which is a number. It is the cardinal number of infinity, and it would be identical minus identicals yields non-identicals. And I submit in reality that's absurd. As for zero, I think zero is very problematic, frankly. I mean, suppose someone said, there's an elephant in the quad. And I said, well, I don't see any elephant in the quad. He says, well, there is an elephant in the quad, and its number is 0. Well, I think that's very problematic. I don't think there is such a thing as 0. It means just the absence of something. Now, as for the argument for the physical evidence for the beginning of the universe, here Dr. Millikan says this depends on current physics. Well, of course it does, but that just is to admit my point, that the evidence of current physics supports the fact of the beginning of the universe. Moreover, this is widely accepted by physicists today. According to James Sinclair, a physicist on the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin singularity theorem is now widely accepted within the physics community. As of this writing, 2009, it has gone largely unchallenged. So the evidence of contemporary cosmology supports my premise that the universe began to exist. Now, if the universe began to exist, then surely it has a cause. And here Dr. Millikan didn't really respond to my point that the vacuum is not nothing, that if something can't come into being without an efficient cause, it's doubly absurd for it to come into being without an efficient or a material cause. Can there be an unembodied mind that created the universe? Well, remember, I suggested that we are minds that are connected with bodies, that we are immaterial substances that produce effects in our physical bodies. And here, unless I misunderstood you, Peter, I thought he said epiphenomenalism is a wreck. I thought that was what he said, and I would agree with that. But if that's the case, then I don't see that there's any argument that's been given tonight against the substance dualist view of human being, that we are immaterial substances conjoined with bodies, and therefore I see no problem in thinking that there might be an immaterial spiritual consciousness or mind, God, who created the universe. Indeed, I've given an argument for that conclusion based on the origin of the universe. Moreover, the argument from fine-tuning supports that. Now, here we have a number of arguments offered in response. I count 9 of them, soundbite-ish arguments. Number 1, we should be cautious about this, of course. Number 2, the probability claims are problematic. I think not. You simply compare the possible range that these constants or quantities could take to the life-permitting range, and you find it is exquisitely narrow, so that a dart thrown randomly at the range would have no meaningful possibility of striking the life-permitting range. The third, fourth, and fifth objections are all based upon the fact that the current physics isn't very well established. And here again, I think most physicists would disagree. Robin Collins, a leading expert in this area, says, the above cases of fine-tuning alone show that the issue of fine-tuning is not likely to be resolved by a future physics. The cases of fine-tuning are multiple and diverse, so even if one cannot be certain of any given piece of evidence, together they constitute a compelling case for an extraordinarily fine-tuned universe. Dr. Law then says, this doesn't give you the moral properties of God. Of course not. I said that in my opening speech. That's what the moral argument gives you. He says that God's omnipotence could just create the universe out of nothing. Why fine-tune it? He's not very efficient. Efficiency, ladies and gentlemen, is an important value only for someone with either limited time or limited resources, or both. God is not limited in time or resources. I think the problem is that he's thinking of God from the perspective of the engineer. But suppose God is more like the artist or the gourmet chef who enjoys the delight of creating a beautiful universe. I don't think we can presume to tell God how he ought to create the universe. Now, Dr. Milliken's eighth point is that there's a lot of empty space in the universe. That is itself a function of the fine-tuning. In order for the stars to cook up the elements for intelligent life, the universe has to expand for a certain amount of time, so that the large size of the universe actually bespeaks the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. And besides, I think there could be extraterrestrial life that God has created elsewhere. As a theist, I'm perfectly open to that. That leads to the ninth objection. The Nicene Creed says that there is only one incarnation of the Son of God. I think the Nicene Creed is written from our perspective on this planet. God, if he has created intelligent life elsewhere in the cosmos, can easily provide for the salvation of those beings, perhaps through another incarnation, perhaps through another means of salvation. Perhaps those beings never fell into sin and need forgiveness and cleansing as we do. That's God's prerogative. So I don't think any of these 9 soundbite-ish objections really take seriously the problem of the fine-tuning, which is an argument that has compelled many physicists and philosophers to take quite seriously the idea that there is a cosmic designer. And of course, if Dr. Milliken then finally deals with the moral argument, the resurrection of Jesus, and personal experience, it's going to be much too late for me to give much response to that tonight. But I hope that I've said enough to convince you that we have good grounds for thinking that theism is true.
And for his final rebuttal, please welcome back Professor Milliken.
Thank you very much. This is really quite a challenge, I have to say. I'm going to start by just responding quickly to some of what Bill has just said. One thing that I found much too quick was the claim that if epiphenomenalism is false, then substance dualism must be true. That is, we must be an amalgam of mind and body where mind is a separate substance. Now, I haven't got statistics on that, but I know that the vast majority of philosophers think that is wrong, but very few are epiphenomenalists, I think. So the consensus of professional philosophers, I think, is very much against Bill here. I didn't anticipate that issue, so I didn't check, but I did check on the moral issue, the issue of moral realism. A recent survey of 900 philosophers, 56.3% of them, that's an absolute majority, were moral realists. But only 14.6% were theists. One rather assumes that the theists were all moral realists. But nevertheless, that's only, what, about a quarter of the number. So there are plenty of moral realists who are not theists, and I don't understand why Bill wants to say that as an atheist, one must presuppose that humans have no intrinsic value. Why would one think that? And I want to sharpen my challenge to him on the issue of morality. I know from what Bill has written elsewhere that he thinks it's entirely possible for an atheist to know what is right and wrong. But what he wants to focus on is the ontological question of what it takes to have an objective moral value. So I'd like him to say more about that. How is it that atheists who don't believe that there's a God, who don't see the evidence for that, are able nonetheless to detect objective moral values? Now, he pushed the analogy with physical objects. The claim is that we can rely on the perception of objective moral values in the same way that we can rely on our perception of physical objects. So you shouldn't be sceptical about objective moral values if you are prepared to accept physical objects, which we all do, of course. But it seems to me there's a bit of a problem here. I ought to perhaps preface this by saying I have real problems with the word objective. So if somebody was to say to me, do you believe in objective moral values? My first question would have to be, well, could you please spell out much more clearly what you mean by objective? Because there's a whole bundle of things that objective could potentially mean. I may come back to those if I have time later. But anyway, here's the issue. If an atheist can perceive a chair and know that the chair is there, without having to worry about what the exact nature of the chair is, and surely we can do that, we can perceive physical objects and yet not know what their real nature is. Presumably an atheist in the same way can perceive moral value without knowing what its nature is. Now, I find it very puzzling how to make sense of this. How can the reality of a moral value depend on God being up there, when God's being up there makes no impact at all on the person who is perceiving and responding to the moral value? I'm not questioning whether a theist might be comforted by the thought that the moral value puts them in tune with the ruler of the universe. Sure. But I don't understand any reason whatever why an atheist cannot believe in objective moral values. And certainly there's no reason why an atheist has to presuppose that humans have no intrinsic value. There are all sorts of things about humans that make them special. We are special, of course we are. You are also of my species, and that might give me a reason to care about you more than I care about others, even if there were nothing special about you. But in fact, there's plenty special about us. We're rational in ways that other animals aren't. And it's quite understandable why one should value that. I mean, I value knowledge, for example, as a philosopher. I think knowledge is a wonderful thing. I think it's valuable in itself. Now, am I going to be able to spell that out in a way that will persuade everybody, or somebody who doesn't see it that way? I'm not sure that I can, but I believe it. But I don't think there being a God up there who is a God of knowledge makes the slightest jot of difference. So I would like an explanation of how it's supposed to. I want to say also a little bit about the resurrection, which I've not yet said anything about. If we had good reason to believe in the supernatural, then perhaps the gospel stories of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth might provide some ground for supposing that this was such an occurrence. But as a basis for belief in God, they seem to me to be feeble. We have 4 accounts, all written many years after the alleged events, not by eyewitnesses, but by devoted Christians who are writing them precisely to spread their religious belief. Matthew and Luke depend very heavily on Mark, and apparently also on another common source which is lost, generally referred to as Q. So these are not independent reports, but even so they contain many discrepancies, not least with regard to the events and timing of Jesus' passion. The Gospel of John seems to be somewhat later, and yet more discrepant, both in chronology and theology. Here Jesus claims divinity in terms not seen in the other Gospels. And anyone who wants to investigate this, I've put a couple of references up there to a book by Geza Vermes and another one by Bart Ehrman. If you really want to know the truth, go and look at the book, see what they say. I think, certainly when I was a believer, I found this kind of thing quite problematic. Despite the discrepancies, the Gospels do cohere reasonably well, but that's not surprising because they were selected by the early church as canonical, whilst many more were rejected as forgeries or heretical. And those are the ones we know of. That's from a different book by Bart Ehrman. So such coherence as there is gives little evidential force. Moreover, they signally fail to cohere, especially in the passion narratives, with non-gospel literature. So here we have from Matthew's Gospel the claim about the veil of the temple being rent, an earthquake, darkness over all the earth for 3 hours, and bodies of the saints being revived and going and walking around Jerusalem. None of this is reported in any other contemporary sources. Are we really supposed to take this seriously as evidence that the scientific worldview is fundamentally wrong? I've got some other points, but I'm probably going to have to stop there.
Thank you. Just before I invite our two debaters this evening to conclude with 5 minutes each, I would like to thank them both, because it isn't easy, a format such as this, but it's an important format, and I think they have handled themselves with dignity and professionalism. I think we owe them a round of applause for that. Could I welcome back for his last 5 minutes, and I mean 5 minutes, Professor Craig.
Well, in my closing comments, let me try to draw together some of the threads of this debate. First, have we seen any good arguments for atheism in tonight's debate? Well, I think it's clear that we haven't really heard any compelling arguments for atheism. All we've heard is that if God existed, then his existence should be more obvious, but that is a highly subjective personal judgment. I see no reason to think it's true, especially if God knew that providing more evidence wouldn't lead to a greater degree of salvation and knowledge of God on the part of human persons. So we've not seen any reason tonight to answer the question, does God exist, in the negative. Have we seen some good reasons to think that theism is true? Well, I think we have. First, the origin of the universe. We've seen philosophical arguments and physical arguments for the beginning of the universe. We've also seen that if the universe began to exist, had an absolute beginning, that it surely must have had a transcendent cause that brought it into being. And whether or not one wants to indict epiphenomenalism or not as a theory of mind, the point is that I can't think of anything that would fit the description of an immaterial, non-spatial, trans-temporal substance which could causally bring the universe into being apart from an unembodied mind. That conclusion is then confirmed by the fine-tuning argument for a designer of the cosmos, which shows that this being must be a mind of incomprehensible intelligence in order to fine-tune this universe for intelligent life. That leads then to the moral argument. Is this creator and designer of the universe a good being? Well, I think so, because if God does not exist, it's plausible that objective moral values and duties do not exist. Here, Dr. Millikan says human beings are rational, but I see no reason to think that that invests them with some sort of intrinsic value on atheism. For example, Sam Harris is an atheist, and he says that the locus of moral value is the flourishing of sentient life. Now that would include rats, snakes, baboons, as well as human beings. So why prefer human flourishing on a naturalist view to just sentient life flourishing? Indeed, why should it be sentient life's flourishing that is the locus of the good? It seems to me that short of God, any sort of explanatory stopping point is just arbitrary. Particularly difficult is the problem of moral obligation and prohibition. Where would these come from if there is no moral lawgiver? Dr. Millikan says most philosophers today are moral realists, but not theists. That's right, and that goes to support premise 2, that objective moral values exist. That's what that shows, but you can't appeal to popular vote to try to say, therefore, theism isn't necessary. The fact is that most moral realists don't have any adequate basis for their moral realism insofar as they're non-theists. He says, but then how can we detect moral values? How do we know what they are? Well, I would say that God may have constituted us in such a way that we can apprehend the moral realm. In fact, that's exactly what the Bible says. It says that God has written his moral law in the hearts of all persons so that we have an instinctual grasp of the moral law. So apart from God, it's very hard to see how we can have objective moral duties, but given God, moral duties and values are in place. Finally, the resurrection of Jesus. Here Dr. Millikan pointed to the discrepancies in the gospel accounts. I want to point out that the 3 facts that I mentioned are agreed upon by the majority of historians today. He said, but what about Vermish and Ehrman? Vermish and Ehrman agree with the facts that I just mentioned. Both of them affirm the empty tomb. Ehrman affirms all of these facts. Here's what Ehrman says, and I quote, there are a couple of things that we can say for certain about Jesus after his death. We can say with relative certainty that he was buried. We also have solid traditions to indicate that women found this tomb empty 3 days later. This is attested in all our gospel sources, early and late, and so it appears to be a historical datum. And so I think we can say that after Jesus' death with some certainty that he was buried, possibly by this fellow Joseph of Arimathea, and that 3 days later he appeared not to have been in his tomb. Ehrman also accepts the appearances and the origin of the disciples' belief. So why doesn't Ehrman accept the resurrection of Jesus? For philosophical reasons. He's a naturalist, and therefore miracles are impossible for Ehrman. The skepticism of biblical critics who deny the resurrection of Jesus is not predicated on historical grounds, but philosophical grounds. The facts that I mentioned are in place. But if you're not a naturalist, if you're open-minded to theism, it seems to me very plausible that the best explanation of the facts is the one the disciples gave. God raised Jesus from the dead. Finally, my 5th point has gone undiscussed today, that you can know God exists by immediate and personal experiencing him. The God who raised Jesus from the dead is alive today and can be known personally, and I would encourage you to seek and find him in your own personal life if you haven't had the joy of doing so yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Craig. And for his final 5 minutes summing up, please welcome back Professor Millikan.
Thank you very much. I disagree with Bill that no arguments for atheism have been presented here, and indeed that I haven't addressed the issue of religious experience. I pointed out at the beginning that religious experience is an extremely unreliable method of knowledge or alleged knowledge. People have religious experiences of all sorts. Perhaps those disciples after the resurrection were having those too. But the appropriate way to check up on those is not biblical scholarship, it's actually experimental psychology. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how likely is it that that evidence could have arisen by perfectly natural means, by human psychology? And that's not begging the question. It needs to be done. We don't yet know the answers, but we will at some point. Now, it seems to me entirely reasonable, if one finds that that evidence can be explained in a natural way, indeed that there were loads of people making divine claims, supposedly performing miracles, that we've got loads of gospels and other written works, not only from Christians but other groups, coming out with all sorts of fantastic stories. It's not surprising you can sift 4 of them and find ones that are relatively plausible, even though, as we've seen, some of what they say seems very far-fetched. Does Bill really believe that those bodies rose from the dead and walked around Jerusalem at the time of the resurrection? Now, it seems to me reasonable that if we can explain these phenomena in natural terms, that is the better explanation. But I haven't just relied on that. I've also relied on the point that there are lots of different supernaturalist beliefs, loads of them, all supported by similar kinds of grounds. And therefore those grounds are no good. And I don't believe that the arguments that Bill has given are good either. Well, sorry, I don't believe that they work. Bill is very keen on appealing to what he can imagine. Now, the problem is that what we can imagine has proved to be a very unreliable guide. I mean, he has problems with the number 0. Yeah, but it's used all the time, and it's used very effectively. And many of us find no problem with it. Infinities, yes, well, they look difficult too. They used to be thought of as completely untamed until Cantor tamed them. Now, in those cases, we have logic and the avoidance of contradiction to guide us. And we can find that these things can be dealt with in a very coherent way. In other cases, like physics, we have to rely on experiment, on observation. Those are the only ways we can know what causes what. Bill continues to appeal to the claim that something can't come into existence without an efficient cause. I've pointed out that he hasn't actually got any reason for making that claim. All right, the quantum vacuum is not nothing, but still, you haven't got any evidence with regard to nothing. And claiming it about the universe, well, there's no evidence for that. So, modern physics, if it teaches us anything, teaches us that these kinds of instincts are not reliable guides. The only thing we can go on is scientific investigation, careful, critical investigation, not taking tradition for granted. Just look at those empty hundreds of years when nothing changed. That's what happens if you rely all the time on tradition. Finally, I haven't mentioned the problem of evil much at all, and that's because I know what Bill's response to that is, which is typically to say, well, we don't know the ways of God. There's so much nastiness in the world that has been rehearsed by plenty of writers. I'm not going to carry on reciting that, though I think it tells a very strong tale. One can always respond, well, God's ways are mysterious. For all we know, he has reasons. Yeah, maybe. For all we know, there's an anti-God, and he's got reasons too. That's no reason whatever for believing in God. Just the fact that the conflicting evidence can be explained away. I mean, think about it. If God is an omnipotent, omniscient agent, he can do whatever he likes. Okay. So what sort of world would you expect him to create? What's the evidence that would show that one particular divine being has been at work rather than another? Well, it's the goodness, isn't it? That's the crucial thing. So the problem of evil shouldn't be called the problem of evil. It should be called the problem of the empirical evidence. The problem of the empirical evidence is that the world we see just doesn't match up to what you'd expect from a perfect God. And moreover, when Bill is saying that morals depends on this God, how does he deal with the fact that the morality that comes from that supposedly omnipotent being, like annihilating 6 whole nations of people because they happen to be in the wrong place, is completely at odds with the morality that the vast majority of us now would accept? So I think the appropriate attitude is, as very often, skepticism, doubt. In fact, in this particular case, I think there's pretty strong evidence against the existence of God, very little in favour. Even if you believe in something supernatural, maybe a supernatural being sufficiently powerful to bring about a resurrection, maybe a sufficiently powerful being to give you a feeling of religious experience, that doesn't show an omnipotent, omniscient being. It doesn't go any way towards showing that. And I haven't seen any arguments that do. Thank you.
Before I move into the questions from the floor, ask them a question that struck me as I was listening to them. You both made a lot about objective moral values, particularly you, Bill, and you had a major problem with the word objectivity, and a lot hangs on that. Can you just go over what you mean by objective moral values, and can you then respond to what your problems are with it?
Right. I'm thinking of something that is normative, but it is independently binding of any community of human persons or any individual human persons actually accepting it.
Your response to that, Pete?
My response is that there are quite a lot of non-theistic theories that would advocate such values. But my problem with the word objective, well, it can mean so many different things. It can mean, impartial, unbiased, making judgments that takes all relevant factors into account and isn't distracted by noise, seeing things from different points of view, measurable. There are so many different uses of the word objective that I think unless one explicates very clearly what it means, it's just too vague to be useful.
Bill?
Well, that was why I stated clearly what I meant.
Let's move on then. Question. If the universe, I think I'm going to go to you first of all, Bill, if I may, for this one. If the universe needs a cause, doesn't God? What causes God?
Remember the argument that I presented. The universe began to exist. If the universe began to exist, then it has a transcendent cause. Therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. The way I usually formulate this argument is the way Peter addressed it. I usually say whatever begins to exist has a cause. That is to say, things don't come into being without causes. But if something never began to exist, if it's eternal, then I don't see any reason to think that it needs a cause. And this isn't special pleading for God. This is what the atheist has in the past always said about the universe. It is just eternal and uncaused. But that, I think, is now untenable in light of modern physics and the philosophical arguments I gave. So God, I would say, is simply a metaphysically necessary, uncaused, eternal being.
Does that not perhaps strike some problems with your arguments about infinity?
Yes, it would if I thought that God existed through a backwards, infinite series of past events. It would apply to the life of God as well as to physical events. And therefore, the conclusion I draw, and the one that is drawn by traditional proponents of this argument, like Al-Ghazali, the medieval Muslim theologian, is that time had a beginning, and that the boundary, as it were, of time is the eternal or the timeless state of God, so that God is timeless without creation. God would be analogous to the cosmological singularity which marks the beginning of the universe in the Standard Model. It is not a point in space-time, it's a boundary of time. And that's what I would say similarly of God's eternity.
Peter?
Yeah. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. I mean, I think there's something a little bit sneaky here in that it can look as though the premise is being cooked up in order to suit God. But I do feel that the question asked makes a good point. Anything that you can say about God, the onus is on the theist to explain why you can't say the same about the universe. If God can be eternal, why can't the universe? If God can exist without a cause, why can't the universe? I also want to make this point that all of our knowledge of any of this stuff, our own intuitions are not reliable. We have to rely on experience. And we don't have any experience of things coming into existence ex nihilo, either with or without a cause, except possibly quantum particles. So I don't see how we can possibly know this. Again, experience tells us that minds are dependent on bodies. And I'm not prejudging the question here about, immortal life and all that, but just think about evolution. Okay, I mean, I take it the fine-tuning argument naturally goes along with support for the theory of evolution. Because if you're just going to create intelligent creatures, just go and do it, right? You don't need to go through all this rigmarole of 13 billion years. Now, in an evolutionary theory, you've got mind arising eventually when we do, but it's coming from body. When babies are born, the body's there first, then the mind comes. Whereas the theistic theory says that in this one unique case, the mind comes first and can exist without the body, and we've got no evidence for that at all.
Just before I ask you to respond about the theory of evolution, you mentioned several times in your presentation and rebuttal about the idea that why didn't God create a perfect world if he was all-knowing and all-seeing? What would that then lead to the argument from perhaps a Christian point of view or a religious point of view about free will?
Oh, I think that's an extremely weak argument. The idea that we're most free when there's least evidence seems to me to be extraordinary. If I have a choice between two things, and one of them is something I really like, and the other one I don't, and I choose the one I really like, then surely to goodness that's a free choice. If, on the other hand, I end up, as it were, tossing a coin, that doesn't make it more free, it makes it less free, if anything. When you freely do something standardly, it's because you've got a reason to do it. So if you've got no reason, that's not freedom.
Bill, can I ask you about the theory of evolution and Peter's point, and then to come back on about free will as well?
Well, theologically, I'm quite open to the theory of evolution. I think that this is a question to be settled scientifically. And any doubts that I might have about the biological theory of evolution would be scientific, not theological. Namely, the explanatory mechanisms of genetic mutation and natural selection have not been demonstrated to be adequate explanatorily to account for this amount of biological complexity in so brief a time. And when you press evolutionary biologists on this, they will admit that they don't really know that these mechanisms are adequate. It's simply an extrapolation from very limited evidence to just a massive macroevolutionary inference. And I fully expect that in this century, we will see a new theory emerge with additional explanatory mechanisms. And that's already beginning to happen in developmental evolutionary biology. Could I make one other very brief point? I think Peter's answer surfaces a very deep difference between us, which we don't probably have time to talk about that tonight. And that is, I think that Peter is what's called an epistemological naturalist, or naturalized epistemology. He takes logic and scientific evidence as the only sources for knowledge, whereas I also accept rational intuition in addition to those. And as Michael Ray has argued in his book, World Without Design, naturalized epistemology is really incapable of justification because it can't be justified through its own resources. You can't prove through logic and scientific evidence that you should only believe what can be proved through logic and scientific evidence. So the only really defensible form of naturalized epistemology is to say this is simply a methodological assumption which a researcher adopts to do his work, but if somebody else wants to have different methodological assumptions, then he's free to do so as well.
So Peter, are you a naturalised epistemologist? I was really pleased with myself then. I've been panicking for the last 5 minutes. How do I pronounce that properly? I ain't saying this again.
Right. Actually, I'm a skeptic. I mean, I'm open-minded, and I'm not dogmatically naturalist. I mean, I think actually naturalism, it's a very... I mean, I think that when you think of somebody who thinks that the only things that exist are physical things, right, it's natural to think in terms of the physics of the 17th and 18th centuries. So we think of things as made of solid matter bashing around into each other. And then you think, well, wait a minute, modern physics isn't at all like that. So what is a natural property when you start getting weird quantum things? And I'm not sure that, I don't see that it's easy to divide things up in this way. Science evolves. What I am committed to is empiricism. We learn from experience what does what.